I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. You know how I've been harping on Deutsche Bank. It's according to the IMF, it's the number one systemically dangerous bank in the world. This is according to the International Monetary Fund, not me. And I've been harping on that as a canary in the global coal mine. That this is trouble, folks. They got a book of business that's, I don't know, 10 times the GDP of Germany. Deutsche Bank's in Germany. And everybody, they're going to keep it propped up. Oh, it's not a big problem. Well, you know what? I'll tell you, I decided to call up my old friend who I have had for a long time, Bill Black, who is a professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, UMKC. Also, he's an expert in white-collar crime. And I'm having Bill Black come on. Bill, thank you for joining us, Professor Black, on USAWatchdog.com.
Good to be back.
Well, I'm sorry it's been such a long time, but I'm thinking to myself, I'm crazy. Maybe I'm nuts. I think this is a big problem, but it's no big deal. They just raided Deutsche Bank. They've got, 18 billion in fines. They got a market cap of 1.5 billion. Call me nutty. I just have a general studies degree, doctor, but that seems like a bad metric to me. Am I crazy? Is Deutsche Bank a problem?
Deutsche Bank is the epitome of what I study as a white-collar criminologist, which is what we call control fraud. And that's a seemingly legitimate entity that is used by the people that control it as a weapon to defraud and commit predation on others. And so Deutsche Bank poses as what they call a national champion bank, the largest bank by far in Germany, but it's actually the largest criminal enterprise in Germany. Which is quite a statement because VW is such a massive fraud as well, as we know.
Could Deutsche Bank and what they're doing, they just were raided again by BaFin and their regulators. This idea that they're just going to prop this up in perpetuity, can they do that? The stock is imploding. It's way below $10 now. Charles Denner said, well, when it hits $8, worry. I'm thinking I'm worried now. Am I crazy? Is this a big problem? Could this take down the global economy?
Well, it's not going to take down the global economy because governments aren't going to let it take down the global economy. But it is the single most dangerous bank in the world. Again, it's not really a bank. It's really a criminal enterprise. Just to list the number of violations it's been caught doing, and that, of course, is only the ones where they've been caught, would take the entire program. You can look online at their corporate rap sheet as of 2017, and then you have to add about 5 more major scandals since 2017. Not just this, but the one that also just broke a week and a half ago now, roughly, was with Danske Bank out of Latvia and the massive money laundering of Russian organized crime funds, basically.
Could this also, but could it, maybe it not take down the global economy, but could it cause a huge market drop? If this thing, they say they're not going to let it go. Okay. But what do they have to do to keep something like this propped up? And what about all the money for all the other Italian bonds, Santander Bank, French banks? What about all the other junk out there just in Europe that they have to keep propping up?
Right. So you're focusing on the right aspect. What things have to be done to prevent what this place richly deserves. So in economics, of course, there's a theory called creative destruction. And there's no more creative destruction than bringing down a criminal enterprise like this. But they're not going to let that happen. And the reason is the one that you note. Were they to do that, there would be an economic crisis at a minimum in Germany, but it would just start in Germany. It would spread to other places. Again, that's why it's not going to happen. But there are major costs of keeping Deutsche Bank under this same leadership. And remember, it's the same chairman of the board who's been there during all of these scandals, and he never loses his job. As you say, the stock has tanked. the Deutsche Bank bonds have been downgraded. The profitability of the bank is terrible. But nothing happens to this chairman of the board. CEOs walk the plank, where he blames them, but never the guy at the absolute top of the organization. So what kinds of things are happening right now because Deutsche Bank is so weak? Well, the first thing that's happening, and this is an inside Basel story. So Basel is, of course, a city in Switzerland, but more to the point, it's how we refer to the process of setting the international banking capital standards. And one of the things we realized out of the last crisis was that banking capital requirements were far too low. So Basel III, as it's called, is supposed to dramatically increase capital requirements. Now, there's pushback, and in the United States is probably not going to go very effectively anymore, which may kill it. But there's been effective pushback for at least 8 years in Germany, precisely because they know Deutsche Bank couldn't come close to meeting adequate capital standards. And as a result, the German government, which of course is a major player in something like the International Basel Accords, has stalled the Basel Accords worldwide, their development of this critical higher capital standard for many years. So that's an example of the costs of not dealing with Deutsche Bank's weaknesses. But other examples of the costs, of course, are that they keep it open. And by keeping it open, it goes from fraud to fraud to fraud because it has a corrupt culture set by the person at the top who they refuse to change. Now, for individual executives, senior executives, this has been a gold mine. They make a ton of money through the bonuses and such, while the shareholders get crunched and while everybody else gets crunched. The latest scandal, the one that prompted, I think, your call, arises out of something from years ago, the Panama Papers disclosures. So that wasn't government, that was investigative reporters in conjunction with a whistleblower from a law firm in Panama that was doing a lot of the tax evasion work internationally. And the whistleblower gave to the consortium of investigative journalists information on many of these clients who were often elites. Well, Deutsche Bank was one of the banks that was heavily involved in those tax fraud schemes for the wealthiest folks, because when you're really, really wealthy, and this statistically is shown by Pew studies and such, you hate paying taxes, right? The idea of paying taxes is just anathema to you. And of course, they have the ability to hire all these kinds of folks to avoid those taxes. In Deutsche Bank context, within this mass of fraud and corruption, two units have been particularly awful. One is their investment banking operation, and the other is called private banking. Now, private banking just means that you deal only with ultra wealthy people. If you don't have $5 million, they won't allow you in the door, type of thing. And most of the folks, of course, have vastly more than 5 million. So again, those folks are largely interested in tax evasion. And so private banking in many banks is a euphemism for doing these kind of sleazy things. Deutsche Bank, this raid, which, by the way, was carried out by 180 law enforcement personnel, and was not just their headquarters in Frankfurt, but 6 other major locations of Deutsche Bank, according to German papers, was prompted by the fact that Deutsche Bank kept on promising that they had cleaned everything up, but that the German authorities had been investigating ever since the Panama Papers, which is over 2 years ago, and had determined, according to the German papers, that they believed that Deutsche Bank was lying to them. What, shock in all of this. So this is a bizarre national champion, right? So the national champion idea is like the joust, right? The knights of old. Except the Deutsche Bank would be a national champion that lost every joust. And not only that, but after it lost, it came out that they cheated and they still lost. So they're corrupt and they're incompetent. So they have at least two of the strikes. And as you say, they endanger the international system. Because they endanger the international system, we don't take protective efforts at other banks, thousands of other banks that are needed to increase capital, which increases the overall risk to the system. And it isn't just that they help people evade taxes who are wealthy, and it isn't just that they help sleazy, corrupt people do so. They also have been heavily involved in money laundering to escape sanctions, right? So you're talking about funding some of the most evil people in the world, who, well, not just espionage, people who actually go out and kill people, right?
Yeah.
But you make a buck as the bankers and such. And again, none of this obviously is good for the soul, but it hasn't been good for the shareholders. Right? As well. They've ripped off the shareholders consistently. They're the greatest threat, as you said, to the international banking system. They're the greatest threat to the German economy and the greatest threat to basically German propriety. Let's put it that way.
Didn't American banks, weren't they involved in this last scandal too, this money laundering thing? Weren't a couple of big American banks involved too?
Oh, yes, but most of the American ones don't do it through Panama.
Okay.
All right. So the biggest money laundering centers in the world is Delaware.
Yeah. Oh, God. Okay.
And there are others in the United States as well. This is not a case of the U.S. being pure. Let me be very clear in all of this. But this insanity level, Sinnlos or Wahnsinnig, in German. Yes, you've got it absolutely right. This is insane that we allow Deutsche Bank to go from fraud to fraud to fraud. And they are, a multiple opportunity fraudster. In addition to things we've talked about, they cheat on everything else you can possibly imagine. And typically they're getting caught, which is also not a very good sign in terms of their competence, even as thieves. There's been, even in the United States, reluctance to crack down on Deutsche Bank, although, in fairness, it is one of the few institutions that at times has failed our so-called stress tests. And, the official position of the U.S. banking regulatory groups is that Deutsche Bank is a problem. But when the New York commissioner tried to crack down, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the sort of the premier federal banking regulator, actually sought to impede that, disparaged the New York folks, said that, that there really weren't all that big of problems and such. All of those proved to be lies. They entered into a settlement with New York and eventually with federal authorities as well. And Deutsche Bank then violated the settlement, as you would expect out of them as well. So this is an institution corrupt at the highest levels that is going to keep on causing problems until you either absolutely change the complete top leadership of the organization, or you merge it with some putatively honest banking organization. But at its size and given how crappy it is, it's not, there are very few folks who even potentially would ever want to acquire this and would actually be better in terms of morals and competence.
Should everybody in the world be afraid of this? this going on, and why? Why does this affect everybody in the world, is what you're telling me? This really does affect everybody in the world because it stops them from regulating other banks and raising capital requirements. Why does Deutsche Bank, why should I care about Deutsche Bank in the United States? Why would I care?
Well, that's why you should care, is that it impedes effective regulation everywhere. And because God only knows what the next thing they're going to do is, but they're going to continue unless something dramatic changes. And, eventually they can cause a next crisis. As I said, Germany is a wealthy enough nation that it would, in conjunction with its power over the European Central Bank, which effectively Germany controls, there will be a bailout, you understand, in these circumstances. But that could help trigger another economic crisis as well. And in any event, it's impairing when the largest bank in in the third largest economy in the world is completely dysfunctional, then the German economy is more likely to go into recession as well. And that is one of the potential sources of the next recession. And you can see lots of people are warning that there are signs that a serious recession is pretty likely relatively soon. Now, relatively soon can be 2 years.
Right, but they just missed on one of their earnings. I mean, they were supposed to get 1.8%, and we were -2%. Wow, they're -2%. Germany. We're talking about Germany here.
Their earnings are terrible.
I mean, I'm talking about the entire country is backing up. You can hear doot 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 doot. I mean, and then when you have all this crime on top of it, when times are good, I guess you can absorb the crime. But when times are bad, can you absorb all that crime?
You can't ever absorb it without cost, period. But again, the German and the Japanese systems are different than the United States. The banks play a vastly more critical role in Germany and Japan. When the banks get really, in terms of providing finance, right? So we have broader markets, stock markets, short-term funding markets for corporates and such, that are dramatically smaller in places like Germany and Japan, even though they're massive economies, right? So when the bank gets sick, and again, Deutsche Bank is the bank in Germany. Yes, there are some other large ones, but it is vastly larger than anybody else. It means that lots of other industries are going to get eventually clobbered. Now, eventually could be many years in these circumstances, because Deutsche Bank is also so big that it isn't a single thing, right? Nobody can really run a place that big. So and that's actually good news in these circumstances. That means that outside of private banking and outside of investment banking, there are just a bunch of folks that have for years funded, say, automobiles. And those folks could be perfectly competent at Deutsche Bank and unaffected by these crazy people off to the side. So that in a bizarre way, we may actually take some comfort in the inability of anybody at the top.
Boy, that's not much. I mean, you're telling me that they stop regulation, they stop capital being increased at the banks. They're setting us up for the next time we have a recession. Deutsche Bank, thank you very much, could cause a whole lot of problems because we didn't do anything, because we tried to prop up one bank. So my premise on that was correct. That what are they giving up? Because I've been asking this question. Okay, they're going to prop up Deutsche Bank. It's huge. What are they? How much is that costing them, and what are they giving up to do this one bank? And what you were telling me, they're giving up a lot.
Yes, and we haven't begun to discuss regulation other than the capital standards. But they're, obviously also not going to be tough in Germany on recognizing losses. on establishing appropriate loss reserves against future losses. They're not going to want to have a vigorous, they're trying to set up a pan-EU, in other words, all EU enforcement body and regulatory body. Well, and they have huge problems doing that because they have no effective regulators, financial regulators, right, that have ever demonstrated that they would stand up to these so-called national champions. But here, Germany is going to make sure that nobody super vigorous is put in charge of any EU body that regulates banks, because what would your first thing be?
Well, which means
absolutely hammer Deutsche Bank.
So the whole system frauds itself out of control, right?
Yes, the whole system weakens itself because it gets caught in this big lie that says we have to pretend like Deutsche Bank is a bank as opposed to a criminal enterprise.
And everybody talks about this, bailout. Well, they'll just get a bailout. Well, we'll just print some money and bail them out. Don't we have a problem with the currency? After trillions of dollars, well, who's going to take confetti for? Hey, I have a cow to sell. Yes, here's some confetti in the form of. Don't we have a problem when the bailouts get this big for the destruction of the euro or the dollar or the yen or whatever? Don't we have a ginormous problem with these bailouts of destroying the currency? Isn't there a downside?
Not in the way probably that you're thinking, but that doesn't mean there are no costs to all of these things. So you have to differentiate between economies that have sovereign currencies and economies that don't have sovereign currencies. And the reason Deutsche Bank is more dangerous is because the EU doesn't have a true sovereign currency. Right? So Japan, for example, has debts roughly 200% of GDP, and it can borrow at next to nothing. So no, the yen isn't treated as being worthless, and it isn't, in fact, worthless, right? But the creation of the euro was not a true currency where you have a true union, right?
Right.
They don't stand behind. You saw they let Greece go to hell. Basically, and they didn't do much for Italy and Spain and Portugal, and those nations at peak had over 50% youth unemployment, and that persisted for something like 8 years, right? You can't imagine what the United States would have happened politically in those circumstances, and you can see part of the rise in Italy, in particular, of these parties. As a result of the situation. And in addition to those things, if you have 50% youth unemployment and you have a system where you can get a college degree essentially for free, what's going to happen? You're going to stay, get your college degree, and then you're going to emigrate immediately. So you were exporting your best and brightest folks. So yes, in the EU, they will have more problems, but the ECB has shown its ability to rise above principle.
But that's a problem, though.
Into economic necessity recurrently. And if it's Germany that needs to be bailed out, as opposed to Italy, right, where they're all about cracking down on Italy for allegedly violating the Stability and Growth Pact, which is an oxymoron developed by regular morons type of thing. It won't be applied to Germany in quite the same way. I think we can all predict, given German hegemony over the EU process, and again, particularly over the ECB.
Well, then,
but within Germany, that will further the divisions, and the AfD. The more populist rank would surge in popularity if that were to happen.
Well, then the EU and the American regulators, they just become part of the fraud, right? Part of the cover-up.
Duh.
Conspiracy. Okay. All right. Well, I just want you to say that, though, not me. I mean, they
Well, I've been
become.
saying that from the beginning. I said that the German government and regulators have impeded the creation of effective capital standards ever since 2008 because of Deutsche Bank's weakness.
Let's talk about Jerome Powell over here. And just to put a cap on this, cherry on top of this, Deutsche Bank could, by what they're doing with it, on a big picture scale, could kind of has weakened all the banks. So in the next time we have a big meltdown, all the banks aren't going to be stronger; they're going to be weaker, which is going to make it worse. Am I wrong?
Well, it depends on your starting position on weaker. So if you mean weaker than 2008, no, because places like the United States have increased capital standards meaningfully. If you mean other parts of the world like Germany, then you would be right about Germany. But the United Kingdom also has, in general, increased capital standards quite meaningfully since 2008. So there are other things that may be worse since 2008, but capital levels aren't them. What, again, Deutsche Bank has prevented is a significant rise beyond what I've described in the US and UK throughout Europe in particular, but also Asia.
Okay, and let's talk about Jerome Powell. He says the rates are neutral. I think, wow, Fed funds rate at what, 2.25%? That's neutral. What do you think about what he came out talking dovish in the morning? Everybody piled into the market. Boom, lots of people made a lot of money.
600 points, baby.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's just like the big tell, like, oh, I'm going to be a little dovish, and then come time for the announcement. Basically, what I want to sum it up. It's December and done, one and done. Rate hike. What do you suppose they're doing at the Fed? What do they see? What's your appraisal of what they're doing, what they've done?
Okay, so these are pretty conventional conservative economists, right? This is what you would get if you just took a random sample of conservative economists. They would continue rate increases on a periodic, phased-in basis, check what was happening in the economy, say growth continues, bump it up another, 15, 20 basis points types of thing, and do that until basically growth isn't excessive and, they supposedly meet their inflation targeting goal. So he's very conventional, in other words. So he's just what you'd expect if you asked Mnuchin for advice on what kind of person to appoint. Mnuchin's going to appoint a conservative Republican, very conventional type.
Do you think that they see the economy slowing down, and they were just like, we things are kind of, housing slowing down, consumer debt is at an all-time high, people didn't pay off their presents from last year, they know all this. Do you think they're like, maybe we better stop? Do you think they see the economy slowing down?
Yes, I think that they see that there's a serious risk of a slowdown, but again, traditional conservative economists, they don't much care about slowdowns, right? Their big thing is that the only goal of a central bank should be containing inflation. And if that causes unemployment, no big deal. So it's the liberal types that pushed for the employment being a dual goal. And the conservative types hate that with a purple passion. So again, Republicans were in charge. They were going to appoint conservative economists, and this is exactly what you would expect. Now, do they have concerns that recession is a serious chance of that happening within the next 2 years? Yes, because that's the overwhelming economic view of folks, and these people share those kind of overwhelming views. Second, it does turn out that in what's in jargon called an inverted yield curve, and that just means that longer term interest rates are actually lower than shorter term interest rates. The San Francisco Fed did a very nice paper fairly recently saying, this actually proves to be a really good predictor of recessions. It's been right in like 7 out of 8 cases, and the eighth, there wasn't a recession, but there was a serious reduction in growth. Well, the United States is close to what might be an inverted yield curve. So that accentuates their belief that a recession fairly soon is fairly likely. Now, all presidents hate recessions, right? Especially going into election years. And indeed, Paul Volcker has just published his memoir in which he says he was brought in with Ronald Reagan and Baker and ordered that he was not to raise interest rates during the election year. Now, it put Volcker in something of a quandary because he had no intention of raising rates, but he also didn't want to be seen as giving in to these kinds of orders. So he was in a really difficult position. Obviously, Trump has gone public that he wants Powell to have an extraordinarily non-conservative economic policy at the central bank. And by the way, Trump during the election did exactly the opposite, claiming that the Fed under Janet Yellen was outrageously expanding the money supply and such, and keeping rates down too low, and then it needed to immediately raise those rates. Of course, as soon as he was president, he managed to rise above those principles as well.
Yeah, that's a good. That's a very good point, and you know the truth when you hear it, and that's exactly what happened. What's your appraisal on the economy? Are we, some people think that we've got that if we get a little recession, I think this, and I think that even if we get a little recession, I mean the global debt went, according to Nomi Prinz and other people, we had 165, trillion dollars somewhere in that neighborhood, and we've raised it up to almost $250 trillion in global debt. You don't have to have a big recession for that white knight to be knocked right off his fine white charger, do we?
No, and so let me give the advice now that I always give after the recession, before the recession. Pay off your high expense credit card debt, all of it that you can. Do not keep borrowing except in circumstances where it really, really makes sense. Like you're going to buy a home and it's a prudent purchase of your home and such. Buy your car when you can afford to buy it with cash whenever possible.
I mean, this is that, and boys and girls, I want you to hear this. I want to put this in context for people. You are a top economics professor at a major university, UMKC, and you're telling people to pay cash and pay off your stuff. I mean, that's your big nugget here. Pay cash, live within your means, pay off your stuff because the storm's coming, right?
Yeah, well, and the storm will always be coming, right? And it just sometimes takes a few more years for the storm to arise, but always try to be a net saver whenever possible.
And do you think this storm could be worse this time with the extraordinary debt level that we've never seen in the history of the planet? I mean, then add on top of all that the derivative complex, which is, who knows what that is, in trillions, hundreds of trillions of dollars on top of that.
So I'll make it slightly nuanced, and that's this. If it occurs earlier, it will be smaller. It's when you get the super bubble that lasts like the last one for 14 years with no effective regulatory intervention. And in a little jargon, losses are not linear. Okay,
Oh,
If
exponential.
they get exponential. That's absolutely right, and that's when losses can double and triple within very short time periods, like a year and such. So if you look, it's really 2003 to mid 2007 that you get absolute insanity. Except it's not insane. It makes sense under these fraud schemes for the bankers to be doing that. Um, and we don't yet have bubbles that are analogous to those 14-year buildup bubbles in housing. So if we simply go into recession, um, 18 months from now, no, I don't think that that will be anything equivalent to the 2008 financial crisis. If we kept gearing up instead, quite the opposite, for another 6, 7 years along the lines that we're doing, then 6, 7 years from now, yes, I think we have an excellent chance of equaling or exceeding 2008.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, thanks for coming on and throwing fastballs. So we have some time to buy here. So Trump may hold the economy together through 2020 is what you're saying. By hook or crook or inflation or whatever it is, you're saying that he may hold the economy together.
Well, and indeed, it's exactly the point you're making, or it's the implication of the point you're making. As long as Americans keep expanding their debt, the economy will keep booming. But there will be a price to be paid, and a bigger price the more that happens and the longer it continues.
You know, you ought to be writing a book. Do you have a book coming out or anything?
I'm always writing.
Do you have anything coming up that you're going to be putting out? Any book or anything like that?
Not within the next year, probably,
Well,
but the year after that, I very much hope to
when you
have
do,
some.
put me on the list, and I'll plug your book and put you on. You're a very bright guy, and I love putting on multiple different experts and different. You know, we had people from all different kinds of views, and you gave an excellent one on Deutsche Bank and all your other views too. William Black, Professor William Black, Professor of Economics and Law, expert in white collar crime from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. William Black, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you again for having me back.